Los Angeles is empty on purpose, and what a former city official is about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about urban policy, immigration enforcement, and who really controls your city. This is not about natural economic cycles or unfortunate circumstances. This is about deliberate decisions made by people with power to transform the second largest city in America into something unrecognizable, something that serves interests far removed from the residents who call these streets home. Over 100 storefronts abandoned in the historic core alone, entire neighborhoods transformed into ghost towns overnight. Businesses that thrived for generations suddenly shuttered and silent. The official narrative blames crime, blames homelessness, blames economic forces beyond anyone's control. But the truth is far more sinister and far more coordinated than random misfortune.
What you are about to discover connects immigration raids to real estate speculation, connects policy failures to intentional displacement, connects the emptying of Los Angeles to plans that were set in motion years before anyone noticed the streets going quiet. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented policy executed with precision and justified with lies. The question is not whether Los Angeles is emptying. The question is who benefits when a city empties, and why did they want it this way? We all remember when these neighborhoods pulsed with life and possibility, when every street corner represented someone's dream made tangible. Santee Alley in the Fashion District used to overflow with shoppers hunting bargains, with music spilling from storefronts, with food vendors serving snacks to crowds that moved like rivers through narrow passages between buildings.
The historic core downtown showcased Art Deco architecture and opulent theater signs that watched over bustling sidewalks where business transactions and human connections happened simultaneously. South Los Angeles, despite all its challenges, maintained vibrant communities where families raised children and built futures against tremendous odds. These were not perfect places. These were working places, living places, places where ordinary people scraped together livelihoods and communities from whatever opportunities the city grudgingly provided. The energy was real. The economic activity was real. The human connections that make cities more than just buildings were real. You felt it when you walked through those neighborhoods, that sense of life happening, of people trying, of communities functioning despite inadequate support and systemic neglect. That was Los Angeles too, not just the glamorous parts that appeared in movies, but the working parts that made the city actually function. Then, everything changed with shocking speed, and the official explanations never quite added up to anyone paying attention. June 2025 brought immigration raids that swept through Los Angeles with aggressive enforcement tactics that administration officials openly admitted were designed to terrify. The raids targeted the Fashion District first, with federal agents apprehending numerous individuals from clothing stores and businesses that had operated for decades. The message transmitted could not have been clearer. Immigrant communities were no longer welcome, and their businesses would be destroyed to prove it. What happened next revealed the true purpose behind the enforcement. Entire neighborhoods emptied overnight as residents stopped going to work, stopped shopping, stopped living their normal lives because the fear of detention and deportation paralyzed communities completely. Santee Alley, which typically throbbed with crowds and commerce, appeared deserted with metal shutters pulled down and secured, even on mild Southern California days. The Fashion District became a ghost town where empty streets replaced the usual throngs of people, and even the mannequins displaying clothing for sale disappeared. Business owners reported losses exceeding those experienced during pandemic lockdowns. A stunning comparison given that COVID shut down the entire economy, while the raids theoretically targeted only undocumented individuals. If the raids only affected people here illegally, why did entire legal communities stop functioning? The answer reveals the true purpose of the enforcement.
Anthony Rodriguez, executive director of the Fashion District Business Improvement District, described the situation as unprecedented and more devastating than pandemic impacts. Businesses that survived COVID closures could not survive the sustained terror campaign that immigration enforcement represented.
The economic damage radiated far beyond the individuals actually detained. Customers stopped coming because they feared being caught in raids even if they had legal status. Workers stopped showing up because traveling to work meant risking detention at checkpoints or random enforcement actions. Suppliers stopped delivering because navigating the area meant encountering federal agents and potential complications. The entire economic ecosystem that sustained these neighborhoods collapsed not because businesses failed, but because coordinated government action made normal economic activity impossible for immigrant communities. And here is where the official story starts falling apart completely. If the goal was simply enforcing immigration law, why target specific business districts? Why concentrate enforcement in economically vibrant immigrant neighborhoods rather than random enforcement across the city? Why time the raids to maximize economic disruption rather than maximize deportations? The answers point to purposes beyond immigration enforcement, to goals that have nothing to do with border security and everything to do with who controls valuable urban real estate. Former city officials who spoke on condition of anonymity because they fear retaliation revealed what actually happened behind closed doors when federal enforcement plans were being developed. The Trump administration did not randomly select enforcement locations. They worked with data showing which neighborhoods had high immigrant populations and high property values, which areas would empty most completely if residents were terrified, which business districts could be destabilized most efficiently. The goal was never just deportation. The goal was displacement, clearing neighborhoods of existing populations so properties could be acquired cheaply and redeveloped for wealthier residents. One former planning department official described seeing maps during interagency meetings that overlaid immigration enforcement zones with real estate development opportunity zones, creating targeting plans that had nothing to do with crime or national security, and everything to do with economic transformation. The official recalled specific conversations where federal representatives openly discussed how enforcement would clear areas for redevelopment, using immigration policy as an urban renewal tool that avoided the legal protections residents would have had if government tried direct displacement. This is not speculation. This is documented coordination between federal immigration enforcement and local development interests designed to empty neighborhoods on purpose. Downtown Los Angeles reveals the same pattern playing out with devastating clarity. Over 100 storefronts sit unoccupied in the historic core, creating a vacancy rate that exceeds Detroit at nearly 1/3 of all commercial properties empty. The official explanation blames crime and homelessness for driving businesses away, but former officials reveal that the city deliberately reduced services and enforcement in downtown areas to accelerate decline. One former city council staffer described how decisions were made to reduce police presence in specific downtown zones, to delay homeless encampment clearances in areas targeted for redevelopment, to deny business improvement district requests for increased sanitation and maintenance. The goal was making conditions so intolerable that existing tenants would break leases and leave, that property values would crash, that developers could acquire buildings for fractions of their previous worth. The staffer recalled meetings where real estate interests presented plans that required clearing existing businesses and residents, where city officials discussed how to create conditions that would accomplish that clearing without direct government action that might trigger legal challenges. They weaponized homelessness, using encampment placements strategically to drive specific businesses away from specific properties. They weaponized crime by reducing enforcement selectively in areas they wanted emptied while maintaining it in areas they wanted protected. The appearance of random urban decay masked coordinated policy decisions designed to empty downtown on purpose. The financial mechanisms behind this coordinated emptying reveal who benefits and why they wanted it this way. Commercial property values downtown have collapsed in recent sales, dropping by 50% or more in some cases, and many owners are seeking public reappraisals of their buildings in hope of reducing property taxes. This creates opportunities for investors with capital to acquire premier downtown real estate at Depression-era prices. Former city finance officials revealed that specific real estate investment groups were briefed on enforcement and policy plans years in advance,
giving them time to prepare acquisition strategies and secure financing for purchases they knew would become available. The official described seeing lists of target properties overlaid with planned enforcement zones and policy changes, creating roadmaps for investors showing exactly which areas would empty and when. This was not public information. This was insider intelligence shared with connected investors, while residents and business owners had no warning their neighborhoods were about to be systematically destroyed. The pattern repeats across multiple Los Angeles neighborhoods. Deliberate policy decisions create intolerable conditions. Existing residents and businesses flee or fail. Property values collapse. Connected investors acquire assets cheaply, and redevelopment proceeds with populations and business types completely different from what existed before. This is not market forces. This is coordinated displacement disguised as unfortunate circumstances. The timing of various policy decisions reveals coordination that cannot be coincidental. Immigration raids began intensifying in June 2025, creating immediate economic devastation in immigrant business districts. Simultaneously, the city reduced homeless services in downtown areas, allowing encampments to expand into commercial zones where they would do maximum damage to remaining businesses. Police enforcement was quietly reduced in specific neighborhoods through reassignments and policy changes that prevented officers from responding to quality-of-life crimes. Business improvement district requests for increased services were denied or delayed. Permit applications for renovations or expansions were slowed through bureaucratic obstacles that broke business owners trying to invest in their properties. Each decision individually could be explained as budget constraints or policy disagreements, but the pattern reveals intentional coordination designed to empty specific neighborhoods during specific timeframes. Former officials described seeing timelines that laid out which policies would change when, which enforcement actions would happen in which sequence, which neighborhoods would be affected in which order. This was planned years in advance and executed with precision while public attention focused on surface problems rather than coordinated causes. But the real estate agenda is only part of what is happening here, and former officials reveal even darker purposes behind the emptying of Los Angeles. The displacement of immigrant communities and working-class residents serves ideological goals beyond mere profit. One former advisor to multiple city council members described conversations where officials discussed how changing the city's demographics through displacement would shift political power, would reduce support for progressive policies, would make the city more governable for business interests. The official recalled specific statements about how removing immigrant communities would reduce political opposition to development, would eliminate organizing capacity that had blocked previous redevelopment schemes, would create a more compliant population of wealthier residents who would not resist corporate interests. This was not about improving neighborhoods. This was about changing who lives in those neighborhoods to change who has power in city politics. The emptying serves as ethnic and economic cleansing, removing populations considered politically inconvenient and replacing them with demographics more friendly to development interests and corporate control. Former officials describe this being discussed openly in private meetings as a feature rather than a bug, as an intended outcome that justified the human costs of displacement. The homelessness crisis itself has been weaponized as a tool for emptying specific neighborhoods while justifying increased police powers and reduced civil liberties. Former officials involved in homelessness policy revealed that the city deliberately concentrated services and therefore homeless populations in specific areas to accelerate their decline. Shelter placements, service centers, and injection sites were strategically located to drive nearby property values down and businesses away. One former homelessness services administrator described being pressured to place facilities in locations that officials openly acknowledged would destroy surrounding business districts, with those decisions justified as serving homeless populations when the actual purpose was destroying neighborhoods targeted for redevelopment. The administrator recalled being told explicitly that certain areas needed to get worse before they could be improved, that concentrating problems would eventually justify clearances and redevelopment that could not happen if homelessness remained dispersed.
The weaponization of homelessness serves multiple purposes. It empties neighborhoods, it justifies increased police powers that can be used for broader displacement, it creates public support for policies that remove visible poverty, even if they do not actually help homeless individuals. The city created the conditions it now uses to justify clearances, deliberately worsening problems so solutions could be imposed that serve development interests rather than human needs. Crime statistics and enforcement patterns reveal the same strategic manipulation. Former police officials described being directed to reduce enforcement in specific neighborhoods while increasing it in others, creating disparities that had nothing to do with actual crime patterns and everything to do with which areas the city wanted emptied versus protected. One former precinct commander recalled meetings where enforcement priorities were explicitly tied to development plans, where officials discussed which neighborhoods needed to feel dangerous to accelerate resident departure and which needed to feel safe to attract new investment. Property crime was allowed to explode in target neighborhoods through non-enforcement while being aggressively prosecuted in protected areas. Homeless encampments were cleared immediately in areas being prepared for redevelopment, but left to expand in areas still being emptied of existing populations. The appearance of random enforcement failure masked strategic decisions about where police power would be applied and where it would be withdrawn. The commander described feeling complicit in destroying neighborhoods through selective non-enforcement, watching communities deteriorate because policy decisions prevented effective policing while other areas received resources that kept them stable. The crime crisis that supposedly explains Los Angeles problems is itself a manufactured crisis deployed selectively to empty specific places on purpose. The office-to-housing conversion push in downtown reveals what comes after the emptying completes, and former officials describe how the entire crisis was engineered to enable transformations that could not have happened without clearing existing populations first. Downtown office towers that commanded premium rents before COVID now sit more than one-third vacant as companies embrace remote work and employees refuse to commute to deteriorating downtown areas. The city now promotes converting these empty towers into luxury housing, using the vacancy crisis to justify transformations that planning departments have wanted for decades but could not implement because of existing uses and populations. Former planning officials described meetings from years ago where conversion scenarios were discussed as future possibilities contingent on emptying downtown of current business activities and populations. The pandemic and subsequent policy decisions created exactly the conditions needed to enable those conversions. One former official recalled seeing documents that laid out how downtown would need to get much worse before conversions would be economically viable and politically possible, how existing businesses would need to fail and leave before transformation could begin. The official described this being discussed as inevitable and even desirable, as creative destruction necessary for Los Angeles to evolve into whatever its next iteration would be. The human costs were acknowledged and dismissed as acceptable prices for economic transformation. Major events coming to Los Angeles serve as deadlines driving the timeline for transformation and explaining why displacement is accelerating now rather than unfolding more gradually. The Olympics, scheduled for 2028, create urgency to complete neighborhood transformations before global attention focuses on the city, before cameras show the world what Los Angeles has become. Former officials involved in Olympics planning described how venue decisions and infrastructure investments were explicitly tied to displacement and redevelopment goals, how the events served as justification for changes that would not have been politically possible otherwise. One former Olympics liaison recalled meetings where officials discussed using the Games as cover for massive clearances of homeless populations and immigrant communities, where the need to present Los Angeles favorably to international audiences justified actions that would be recognized as ethnic cleansing in other contexts. The official described timelines working backward from 2028, calculating how quickly neighborhoods needed to be emptied and transformed to create the version of Los Angeles that organizers wanted visitors to see. The Olympics are not just happening in Los Angeles. The Olympics are being used to remake Los Angeles according to visions that exclude most people currently living here.
Empty streets, empty shops, empty promises about what was happening and why. This is what coordinated displacement looks like when government works with capital to transform cities according to plans that benefit the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Los Angeles is not emptying because of natural economic forces or unfortunate policy failures. Los Angeles is being emptied by deliberate decisions made by people who benefit when working-class residents and immigrant communities disappear. When property values crash so connected investors can acquire assets cheaply, when demographics shift to populations more politically compliant and economically lucrative. The former officials who spoke risked their careers and potentially their safety to reveal what actually happened, to document that the suffering and displacement and community destruction were not accidents, but intended outcomes of coordinated policy. They described feeling haunted by what they participated in or witnessed, by decisions they made or failed to oppose that destroyed neighborhoods and displaced thousands of people whose only crime was being in the way of someone else's vision for what Los Angeles should become. The emptying serves purposes beyond anything acknowledged publicly, purposes that would not survive honest scrutiny or democratic input if residents understood what was actually happening and why. The media narrative about Los Angeles' decline carefully avoids connecting the patterns that reveal coordination and purpose. Stories focus on isolated problems like crime or homelessness or immigration, without examining how these supposedly separate crises happen to concentrate in exactly the neighborhoods targeted for transformation, happen to unfold in sequences that enable specific development outcomes, happen to serve purposes beyond their official justifications. Former journalists who covered City Hall described being pressured to avoid certain angles, to not connect certain dots, to treat coordinated displacement as random urban decay. One former reporter recalled investigations that were killed by editors after pressure from city officials and advertisers with development interests, stories that would have revealed the coordination behind neighborhood destruction. The reporter described frustration watching obvious patterns go unreported, while colleagues repeated official narratives that anyone paying attention knew were false. The information control ensures that residents experience displacement as individual misfortunes rather than recognizing the coordinated nature of what is happening to their communities. If people understood this was intentional, if they recognized the patterns in coordination, resistance would be possible. The narrative control prevents that understanding from forming until transformation is complete and irreversible. But here is what they did not anticipate. The emptying is happening too completely, too obviously, too quickly for narratives to contain. When entire neighborhoods become ghost towns overnight, when business districts that thrived for generations suddenly stand vacant, when residents can see with their own eyes that something coordinated is destroying their communities, official explanations stop making sense. The former officials speaking out represent cracks in the coordination, individuals whose consciences or self-interest finally outweighed their loyalty to plans they participated in creating. More will follow as the human costs become impossible to ignore or justify, as the gap between official narratives and lived reality grows too wide to bridge with spin. The emptying of Los Angeles may succeed in displacing current populations and enabling transformation, but it will not succeed in making people forget what was done to them or preventing them from understanding why it happened. The truth emerges eventually, and when it does, the people who coordinated this displacement will face judgment from populations they tried to erase. If you have watched your neighborhood empty and wondered why it happened so quickly, if you suspected that something coordinated was destroying your community but could not prove it, share your observations in the comments, because your stories document what officials want hidden. And if this revelation disturbs you as much as it should, subscribe, because the next investigation might reveal which other cities are being emptied right now using the same playbooks. Which other populations are being targeted for displacement disguised as unfortunate circumstances? It is time we recognized coordinated displacement for what it is. Time we understood that the emptying of our cities serves purposes that benefit the powerful at our expense. Time we resisted transformation that requires our communities to be destroyed. Los Angeles is empty on purpose because people with power wanted it that way, planned it that way, and executed that plan while lying about their intentions. That is the truth former officials revealed at great personal risk. That is what the empty streets and shuttered businesses actually represent. That is why your city is disappearing while you watch helplessly. Now you know. Now you cannot pretend this is random or unavoidable. Now you have to decide what you are going to do about it.